On the night of July 4th, 1776, in a Philadelphia print shop, a man set a single line of type. It called the destruction of frontier families the work of merciless Indian savages. 600 miles to the southwest, the people that line described were preparing to defend their homes. In the same weeks, two peoples declared they would not be ruled by an empire taking their land. One of those declarations we read aloud every year. The other was answered with fire. 36 towns burned, a harvest destroyed, a nation driven toward starvation. This is the other war of 1776. The other war of 1776, the Cherokee fight for their homeland. Before it was a battlefield, the southern Appalachian country was a homeland, some 40,000 square miles of river valleys and blue mountains. The Cherokee lived in clusters of self-governing towns, the overhill towns on the Little Tennessee and the Hiwassee, the middle and valley towns in the western Carolinas, the lower towns in the upcountry of South Carolina and Georgia, with vast hunting grounds reaching north into Kentucky. Their beloved town, Chota, held a council house that could seat 500. But its authority was moral, not commanding. No single chief and no one council could bind the whole nation. That would come to matter a great deal. And the pressure on that land never stopped. To keep the peace after an earlier war, the Crown had drawn a line in 1763 along the crest of the Appalachians, reserving the West for the Indian nations and forbidding private men from buying their ground. Colonists resented that line precisely because it tried to hold them back. Treaty by treaty, the boundary was pushed westward, and where the treaties did not reach, settlers simply squatted on Cherokee land and dared anyone to remove them.
No private person do presume to make any purchase from the said Indians of any lands reserved to the said Indians. The same shall be purchased only for us, in our name, and at some public meeting of the said Indians. George III, by his royal proclamation of 1763.
In March of 1775, a North Carolina judge and land speculator named Richard Henderson called more than 1,000 Cherokee to Sycamore Shoals. Through his Transylvania company, he offered a cabin full of trade goods, shirts, guns, and trinkets for some 20 million acres of Kentucky and Middle Tennessee, half of a future state for a wagon load of goods. The elder chiefs, Attakullakulla and Oconostota, made their marks on the deed. But the land was held in common and partly shared with the northern nations. No headman had the right to sell it, and both Virginia and North Carolina declared the purchase void. And still the settlers came. Into that council stepped Attakullakulla's own son, a war leader whose name was Dragging Canoe. He refused to sign and walked out. By tradition, he turned at the door and warned them what their purchase would cost.
You have bought a fair land, but there is a cloud hanging over it. You will find its settlement dark and bloody. Dragging Canoe at Sycamore Shoals, the spring of 1775.
The words are traditional, set down secondhand, and polished by later historians, but their meaning is beyond dispute. Where his father's generation had learned the price of war, Dragging Canoe had learned the price of peace. Every treaty, every council, every friendship had ended the same way, with less Cherokee land than before. He had watched other eastern nations dwindle to remnants. He would not, he said, go quietly into the same fate. But the Cherokee did not go to war as one people. The elders, Attakullakulla, Oconostota, and later Old Tassel, counseled patience to spare the towns another catastrophe. The younger warriors, gathered around Dragging Canoe, had had enough of patience. In the spring of 1776, The argument was settled by visitors from the north. A delegation of Shawnee and other nations carried a war belt into Chota and called for a united stand against the settlers pressing on every frontier. Dragging Canoe took the belt. British agents were in the towns as well. The superintendent's deputies, one of whom had married into the nation, arriving with pack horses of powder and lead. Patriots would later blame the whole war on British instigation. But the evidence is more awkward than that. The British wanted the Cherokee to wait, to strike only in concert with the king's troops on the coast. The superintendent, John Stewart, wrote to London that he had no orders to loose them at all.
As I have no instructions to employ the Indians, I shall use my utmost endeavors to keep them in temper, without attempting anything further, until I shall first have been honored with orders. John Stewart, His Majesty's Superintendent, May 1776.
The agent on the ground even asked the warriors to hold for 20 days. A Cherokee war leader answered that the time was appointed, and he would not be disappointed. Britain supplied the powder. It did not command the war. And so the calendar itself became the story. As the Continental Congress debated independence through the first days of July, the Cherokee were already mustering. On the 2nd of July, Congress voted to break with the Empire. On the 4th, it approved the words, including a single line, naming the very people then marching to defend their homes.
He has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. The Declaration of Independence, July the 4th, 1776.
The charge was aimed at the king, accused of setting the frontier aflame. But the words on the parchment did not truly describe the king. They described the Cherokee. And they were written in the same weeks by the same revolutionary movement for the same reason the war itself was being fought: land. In the eastern cities, the news of independence was met with bonfires and bells and joy.
The 2nd day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, from one end of this continent to the other. I am John Adams, the 3rd of July, 1776.
In the same days the eastern cities celebrated, the frontier braced for war. Warned by traders and, by tradition, by a Cherokee beloved woman named Nancy Ward, who did not want the settlers slaughtered, the families on the Watauga and the Holston crowded into their forts. The Overhill offensive went out in 3 prongs: Dragging Canoe toward the Holston, Old Abraham toward the Watauga, the Raven toward Carter's Valley. On the 20th of July at Island Flats, Dragging Canoe met not the handful of men he expected, but a militia drawn up and waiting. His warriors were thrown back, and their leader fell, wounded. The next morning, Old Abraham struck Fort Watauga, where James Robertson and John Sevier held the palisade. The assault settled into a siege of some 2 weeks. This is where the frontier's legends gather. A captured woman spared through Nancy Ward's intervention, a young bride who leapt the stockade wall into the arms of the man she would marry. Some of it is documented. Much of it is family tradition, gathered a lifetime later. But this much is certain. Most of these settlers fought and died before word of any declaration could even have crossed the mountains to reach them. The Cherokee had struck at the illegal settlements. The answer was aimed at their entire world. Within weeks, 4 colonies put more than 5,000 men into the field. Williamson out of South Carolina, Rutherford out of North Carolina, Christian out of Virginia, and Jack out of Georgia, converging on the Cherokee towns from every side. There were few real battles. The sharpest was an ambush at Waya Gap, in a place the militia called the Black Hole. The Cherokee mostly fled ahead of the columns. And so the campaign was not in the end, fought against warriors. It was fought against towns. The numbers reveal the method. Rutherford and Williamson together burned at least 36 towns, while Rutherford's own men recorded killing just 12 Cherokee. It was a war on food and shelter, waged deliberately at the harvest. Standing corn cut down, orchards girdled, granaries put to the torch, the livestock killed. South Carolina set a bounty on Cherokee scalps and declared captured children the slaves of whoever took them. One North Carolina captain, burning a middle town, set down the argument among his own men over 3 prisoners, women and a boy.
The greater part swore bloodily that if they were not sold for slaves upon the spot, they would kill and scalp them immediately, upon which I was obliged to give way. Then the 3 prisoners was sold for 242 pounds. Captain William Moore of the North Carolina Light Horse, November 1776.
Even the British, watching from the coast, set down what their enemies were doing on the frontier and recorded it as an atrocity.
The rebel government have not only offered considerable rewards for the scalps of those Indians, but declared their children of a certain age the slaves of the captors. Lord George Germain, His Majesty's Secretary of State, November 1776.
That winter, the Cherokee starved. Families watched the smoke rise from towns they had burned themselves rather than leave them to the enemy and fled into the cold of the mountains. Hundreds more sought refuge with the British in Florida. There was no negotiation between equals. With their towns in ashes and their people hungry, the elder chiefs sued for peace and signed away enormous stretches of territory. Nearly all the remaining Cherokee land in South Carolina was gone by the spring of 1777. Much of present-day East Tennessee followed that summer, at the Treaty of the Long Island of Holston. At that treaty ground, an Overhill orator named Old Tassel put the contradiction to the Americans directly. He did not deny that they had won. He asked, instead, by what right a conquest could be turned into ownership, and why the newcomer's way of living should be the only measure of a claim to the land.
You marched into our towns with a superior force. Will you now claim our lands by right of conquest? You say, why do not the Indians till the ground and live as we do? May we not, with equal propriety, ask, why do not the white people hunt and live as we do? Old Tassel, at the Long Island of Holston, 1777.
The peace faction signed to save the survivors. Among the voices for peace was Nancy Ward, the beloved woman who had warned the settlers a year before. Years later, at another treaty fire, she would speak not only for the Cherokee, but as a woman to the men on every side who made the wars.
You know that women are always looked upon as nothing. But we are your mothers. You are our sons. Our cry is all for peace. Let it continue. This peace must last forever. Nancy Ward, beloved woman of Chota, 1781.
But one man would not sign. Dragging Canoe denounced the treaty chiefs and led some 500 followers southwest to new towns on Chickamauga Creek, near present-day Chattanooga. And there he kept fighting, a resistance that would last, in one form or another, until 1794. He had understood, from the very beginning, what the newcomers wanted. And in the East, the men of the new republic were already writing about the Cherokee future in the plainest terms. Thomas Jefferson, who had drafted the words upon the parchment, put it in a letter that same summer.
Nothing will reduce those wretches so soon as pushing the war into the heart of their country. But I would not stop there. I would never cease pursuing them while one of them remained on this side the Mississippi. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter, August 1776.
When an American expedition burned the Chickamauga towns 3 years later, Dragging Canoe was still not finished. By tradition, he took up the old war belts and answered the men who came to tell him the fight was over.
We are not yet conquered. Dragging Canoe, 1779.
Dragging Canoe died in 1792, still at war. But the pattern set in 1776 outlived him. Burn the towns, force the cession, settle the land, and repeat. It fed the broken treaties of the decades that followed, guarantees the United States solemnly made and failed to keep. It fed the murder of old Tassel under a flag of truce, and it ran in a straight line to the removal that ended on the Trail of Tears. The Declaration is not diminished by setting the Cherokee War beside it. It is completed by it. The colonists' argument was true, that a free people has the right to resist an empire that would take its land and rule it without consent. It was simply not a right the new nation was willing to share with the people whose land it meant to occupy. And that is the question the summer of 1776 leaves with us, still. When Americans declared their own right to resist conquest, why would they not recognize the same right in the Cherokee?